Going on to the next topic, film genres. Don't get afraid of different pronunciation of genres. It is pronounced as genre, 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 etc. The spelling is G-E-N-R-E. So for the convenience sake, I am pronouncing it as genres. Film genres. First of all, documentary or factual films. Documentary or factual films. Factual. Factual means based on facts only. Factual or actual. Actual and factual matters including contemporary issues and people form the subject matter of documentaries. The topic of documentaries or the subject of documentaries is contemporary issues and people. The actual and factual matters including contemporary issues and people form the subject matter of documentaries. They try to educate, inform, communicate and raise our consciousness in relevant problems. What do these documentaries do? See, what is the purpose of documentary? Documentaries try to educate, inform, give information, communicate and raise our consciousness, raise our ideas and thoughts, raise our consciousness in relevant problems, relevant contemporary problems. That is what documentary does, or that is what documentaries do. Documentaries are mostly filmed in actual locations. The locations of their actual occurrences, making use of natural light and sound. Documentaries make use of the natural sound like the chirping of birds, the sound of the flowing water, etc. Natural sound they use and natural light, the sunlight they use. They capture real people living in their own living situations. Documentaries capture living people in their own living situations. അതായത് ഡോക്യുമെൻ്ററീസിൽ അവതരിപ്പിക്കുന്നത് എന്താണ്? അവരുടേതായ സാഹചര്യങ്ങളിൽ ജീവിക്കുന്ന ആളുകളെ അതേപടി പകർത്തുന്നു. സ്വാഭാവികമായ ശബ്ദം, സ്വാഭാവികമായ സൂര്യൻ്റെ വെളിച്ചം, ഇതൊക്കെയാണ് ഡോക്യുമെൻ്ററീസിൽ ഉപയോഗിക്കുന്നത്. സോ ദീസ് ആർ വാട്ട് യൂസ്ഡ് ഇൻ ഡോക്യുമെൻ്ററീസ്. The history of documentaries begins with the Lumiere brothers who made films in the 1890s. Remember? The history of documentaries, when we trace the history, when we go back to the history of documentaries, we reach Lumiere brothers. The history of the documentaries begins with the Lumiere brothers because Lumiere brothers have depicted the workers leaving the Lumiere factory and the train arriving at a railway station, etc. They are of course short documentaries. They made films. Lumiere brothers made films in the 1890s out of contemporary social life. They made films out of contemporary social lives. That is how they have made documentaries. John Grierson, a British man. John Grierson is credited as the founder of British documentary movement. John Grierson is credited as the founder of British documentary movement. Who is credited to have founded the British documentary movement? John Grierson. John Grierson is credited as the founder of British documentary movement. He defined documentary as the created treatment of actuality. According to John Grierson, documentary means created treatment of actuality. യാഥാർത്ഥ്യത്തെ പുനരവതരിപ്പിക്കുന്നത്, യാഥാർത്ഥ്യമായി ഉണ്ടായിരുന്ന ഒന്നിനെ പുനരവതരിപ്പിക്കുന്നത്, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഉള്ള ഒന്നിനെ പുനരവതരിപ്പിക്കുന്നതാണ് ഡോക്യുമെൻ്ററി. ദാറ്റ് ഈസ് ദി ഒപ്പീനിയൻ ഓഫ് ജോൺ ഗ്രിയേഴ്സൺ, ദി ഫേമസ് ബ്രിട്ടീഷ് documentary theorist. How did he define documentary? He defined documentary as the created treatment of actuality. He revealed that cinema could be used an excellent medium for information, education and propaganda. So he showed that cinema, the medium of cinema could be used as an excellent medium for information, education and propaganda. പ്രചരണം, വിദ്യാഭ്യാസം, അതുപോലെ അറിവ് സമ്മാനിക്കാനുള്ള ഏറ്റവും നല്ല മാധ്യമമാണ്, ഉപാധിയാണ് സിനിമ. അദ്ദേഹം വെളിപ്പെടുത്തി. He revealed that cinema could be used as an excellent medium for information, education and propaganda. He voiced his concern about the intellectual aspects of democracy. He also opined about the intellectual aspects of democracy, such as lack of education among the electorate. His major concern was the lack of education among the electorate. Electorate means voters. Through a series of documentaries which he brought out between 1930 and 1939. During the period from 1930 to 1939, he brought out a series of documentaries through which he raised the problem of not having proper education among the electorate or voters. അതായത് വോട്ടേഴ്സിനിടയിൽ വിദ്യാഭ്യാസക്കുറവെന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ നമ്മുടെ ഭരണ നേതൃത്വത്തെ സാരമായി ബാധിക്കുമെന്ന് അദ്ദേഹം 1930 മുതൽ 39 വരെ എടുത്ത ഡോക്യുമെൻ്ററീസിലൂടെ അദ്ദേഹം പ്രൂവ് ചെയ്തു. അല്ലെങ്കിൽ he voiced that. He raised his voice about that. So what was his opinion? He opined that the lack of proper education among the electorate may badly affect or adversely affect the election process. He proved it through a series of documentaries which he brought out during the period from 1930 to 1939. Nanook of the North, Nanook, Nanook of the North, which was released in 1922, which was out in 1922 by Robert Flaherty. It was a documentary made by Robert Flaherty. He is acclaimed as the very first documentary which portrayed the everyday lives of Eskimos. When you trace the history of documentaries, we can see that the very first documentary that is acclaimed by film theorists is Nanook of the North. Nanook of the North, which was out in the year 1922. Nanook of the North, which came out in the year 1922 by Robert Flaherty, is acclaimed as the very first documentary. This documentary portrayed or depicted or showed the everyday lives of Eskimos, the day-to-day life of Eskimos. മഞ്ഞുമലയിൽ താമസിക്കുന്ന എസ്കിമോസിൻ്റെ ജീവിതമാണ് നാനൂക്ക് ഓഫ് ദി നോർത്ത് എന്ന് പറയുന്ന ഡോക്യുമെൻ്ററി, റോബർട്ട് ഫ്ലാഹർട്ടിയുടെ ഡോക്യുമെൻ്ററി ചിത്രീകരിച്ചത്. അതാണ് ആദ്യത്തെ ഡോക്യുമെൻ്ററിയായി ഫിലിം തിയറിസ്റ്റുകളും ക്രിറ്റിക്സും ഒക്കെ കരുതുന്നത്. Then according to another film theorist, Susan Hayward, another film theorist, Susan Hayward, truth and speaking subject are the two important aspects of the documentary. Truth and the speaking subject, they should have proper connection. They must have proper relationship. Truth and speaking subjects are the two important aspects or sides or elements of the documentary according to the film theorist Susan Hayward. Don't forget it. Authenticity of the documentary is another crucial factor. Authenticity, അതായത് വിശ്വസനീയത, ആ കൃത്യത, ആ യഥാർത്ഥ്യം, അതും ഡോക്യുമെൻ്ററിയുടെ നിർണായകമായ ഒരു ഘടകമാണ്. Authenticity of the documentary is another crucial factor. During the Second World War, Humphrey Humphrey Jennings. During the Second World War, Humphrey Jennings, a poet and painter, he was a poet and painter by profession. He was very much interested in surrealism. In painting, he used surrealism, and he wanted to depict surrealism in films also. So Humphrey Jennings, a poet and painter interested in surrealism, brought out certain documentaries focusing on everyday lives and sounds of men and women. During the Second World War, Humphrey Jennings, a poet and painter, interested in surrealism, brought out certain documentaries focusing on everyday lives of people and sounds of men and women. His famous documentary is Spare Time, S-P-A-R-Time, Spare Time, Free Time, which was out in the year 1939, the beginning at the year in which the Second World War started. Then further development in the field include the television reportage and the observational documentaries on the lives of working people and poverty, especially in the non-Western countries. Further development in the depiction of documentary include a television reportage. Television reportage, as we know, is another type of documentary. Television reportage. And observational documentaries, the documentaries which observe the lives of working people and poverty, especially in the non-Western countries like India, China, Turkey, Nigeria, Algeria, etc. These are all examples of documentaries. Further development in the field include television reportage and the observational documentaries on the lives of working people and poverty of the people, especially in the non-Western countries. Non-Western countries, mainly India, China, Turkey, Nigeria, Algeria. So the UAE and Egypt also included, but they do not suffer from poverty. Other countries have poverty, and so many people are interested in depicting the lives of the poor people there. Show. S-H-O-A-H, show, a very large, much longer documentary, show, which was out in the year in 1985, is Claude Lensman's. The maker is Claude Lensman. The documentary maker is Claude Lensman. Claude Lensman's 9-hour documentary. It is a 9-hour documentary. The documentary is lasting 9 hours. It is a bigger, longer documentary, 9-hour documentary on the Holocaust. Holocaust means the Second World War, genocide of the European Jews. We know that Hitler subjugated or killed so many Jews during and after the Second World War. And this is portrayed in a 9-hour documentary by Claude Lensman. And also this very subject is filmed by Steven Spielberg in Schindler's List. The subject matter is this Holocaust. So Show 1985 is Claude Lensman's 9-hour documentary on the Holocaust, Second World War, genocide of the European Jews. In the present times, the corrupt practices of capitalism. The subject matter or the topics which form the documentaries are the corrupt, C-O-R-R-U-P-T, not correct practices of capitalism. Globalization is another subject. Climate changes, wildlife, fears, adventurous things and follies, and artistic talents of individuals, artistic talents of persons. നമ്മൾ ടി വി ഷോയിലൊക്കെ കാണിക്കുന്ന ഓരോ വ്യക്തികളുടെയൊക്കെ ആർട്ടിസ്റ്റിക് ടാലൻസ്. നമ്മുടെ ഈ കൗമുദി ചാനൽ കാണിക്കുന്ന ഈ പാമ്പ് പിടുത്തം പോലൊരു ഡോക്യുമെൻ്ററിയാണ്. ഇറ്റ് ഈസ് എ ഡോക്യുമെൻ്ററി. See, which are the subjects that form the documentaries of the current time or the present time? In the present times, the corrupt practices of capitalism, globalization, climate change, wildlife, fields, follies and artistic talents of people, individuals, contribute to the subject matter of documentaries. And also there is hybrid documentaries. Hybrid means mixture of documentaries, which include docudrama, docu-soap fiction, documentary and soap fiction, documentary and fiction, documentary and fiction, documentary and drama, docudrama, docu-soap fiction. Soap fiction means a kind of fiction. Even reality shows come into the category of documentaries. We can also say that the reality shows shown on TVs, telecast on TVs, also fall under the category of documentaries. These are the types of documentaries that prevail in our present world. Docu-soap fiction. Docu-soap means documentary and soap opera. Documentary plus soap opera. It is fact and fiction, or in an understandable way, in the simplest way, we can say it includes fact and fiction. So these are the various types of documentaries: docudrama and docu-soap fiction. And now let us jump into narrative. What is narrative? So we have already studied about narrative, so a long discussion on narrative is out of place. We do not require a long discussion narrative, because in classical Hollywood cinemas, etc., and in editing also we have discussed the narrative. Anyhow, narrative refers to the unique way of storytelling. It refers to the unique, unparalleled way of storytelling. Narrative refers to the unique way of storytelling. It helps the reader in literature, it helps the reader, or in film, it helps the audience to create an imaginary construction which forms the story. In our minds, we construct an imaginary story in our minds, or we create an imaginary construction of the story while reading a narrative book or a narrative film. That is what happens. That is really what happens when we watch a narrative movie or when we read a narrative in literature. It helps the readers or the audience to create an imaginary construction which forms the story. The actual arrangements of the signifiers, signifier, sign, signifier and signified. Here signifiers means in literature it is words, and in cinema or film it is shots. The actual arrangements of the signifiers that communicate the story forms the narrative. Actually, what is narrative? The actual proper chronological arrangements of the signifiers that communicate the story, which communicate or inform us the story, forms the narrative. It is actually what is narrative. When asked about narrative, what will be your answer? The actual arrangement of the signifiers that communicates the story forms the narrative in literature and in movies. These signifiers may be words in literature text. In literary text it may be words or moving images and written titles. In films the signifiers are sometimes titles. The titles were extensively used in Charlie Chaplin's silent movies that we have earlier discussed. So signifiers may be in literature, in literary text, it may be words and moving images and written titles in films. Story or the fabula. Fabula is a term which is used in linguistics and criticism. Fabula means story, fabula. You know, the story of the fabula is conveyed through plot. Plot has another word in criticism and linguistics, that is sujet. S-Y-U-Z-H-E-T, sujet. Don't forget fabula and sujet. Fabula story is sujet plot. Sujet plot, fabula story. Fabula, what is fabula story? What is sujet plot? So, moving images and written titles convey the story in films, or they are the signifiers in films. You know, story or the fabula is conveyed through plot. The story of a literary text or film is conveyed through plot. Plot means the plot includes all the events and characters. All the events and characters form the plot or sujet. The narrative film follows a typical pattern, which is the typical pattern enigma and a resolution. Enigma, a crisis and its a resolution. A crisis, a puzzle and its a resolution. Enigma and its a resolution. We have earlier found it. The narrative films follow a typical pattern, involves an enigma and a resolution. Solving of that enigma, solving of that puzzle. The structure of the plot is constructed in such a way that a particular event disrupts the harmonious world of the narrative. You know, obviously story is constructed in narrative. The structure of plot means events and characters. The structure of the plot is constructed in such a way that a particular event, when we examine all the narratives, ഇപ്പോൾ ഉദാഹരണങ്ങളൊന്നും പറയുന്നില്ല, കാരണം ഉദാഹരണം പറയണമെങ്കിൽ മിക്കവാറും സിനിമകളെല്ലാം നാരറ്റീവ്സ് ആണ്. എല്ലാ നാരറ്റീവ്സിലെന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ അതിൻ്റെ ആദ്യം തുടക്കം എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ വളരെ രസകരമായിരിക്കും. നമ്മുടെ ദൃശ്യം പോലെയൊക്കെയുള്ള ഫിലിംസിൽ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ എല്ലാ മിക്ക സിനിമകളിലും വളരെ സന്തോഷകരമായ സാഹചര്യം, ഏതെങ്കിലും ഒരു ചെറിയ ഇൻസിഡൻ്റാണ് ആകെ തകർക്കുന്നത്. അവസാനം അതിന് മനോഹരമായ ഒരു എൻഡ്. അപ്പോൾ നല്ലൊരു ബിഗിനിങ് ഉണ്ട്, നല്ലൊരു മിഡിലുണ്ട്. അരിസ്റ്റോട്ടിലിയൻ തിയറി പോലെ നല്ലൊരു മിഡിലുണ്ട്. അതുപോലെ തന്നെ ഒരു നല്ലൊരു എൻഡും വേണം ഏതിന്, നാരറ്റീവിന്. The structure of plot is constructed in such a way that a particular event disrupts or breaks the harmonious world of the narrative. This will lead to a chain of events in cause and effect relationship, and this particular event disrupting the harmonious world will lead to തുടർന്നെന്താ a chain of events. തുടർന്ന് ഒരുപാട് സംഭവ വിഗതികൾ ഉണ്ടാകും in cause and effect relationship. എല്ലാ എഫക്റ്റിനും ഒരു കോസ് ഉണ്ട്, എല്ലാ റിസൾട്ടിനും ഒരു കോസ് ഉണ്ട്. അങ്ങനെ കോസ് ആൻഡ് എഫക്റ്റ് റിലേഷൻഷിപ്പ് അനുസരിച്ച് കഥാഗതി നീങ്ങുന്നു, അവസാനം സ്മൂത്തായിട്ട് എൻഡ് ചെയ്യുന്നു. ദാറ്റ് ഈസ് വാട്ട് ഹാപ്പൻസ് ഇൻ നാരറ്റീവ്സ്. Vladimir Probst's work on the narrative structure of the Russian folk tale has inspired the development of the narrative as an important area in film. നമ്മൾ നാരേറ്റീവിൻ്റെ ചരിത്രം പരിശോധിക്കുമ്പം റഷ്യക്കാരനായ വ്ളാഡിമിർ പ്രോപ്പ് എന്ന് പറയുന്ന ഒരു ഫിലിം മേക്കർ, വ്ളാഡിമിർ പ്രോപ്പ് റഷ്യൻ ഫോക്ക് ടെയിലിനെ, നമ്മുടെ വടക്കൻ പാട്ടുകൾ പോലെ റഷ്യയിലെ ഫോക്ക് ടെയിലിനെ, നാടോടി കഥകളെ ആസ്പദമാക്കിയാണ് ആദ്യമായി നാരേറ്റീവ് കഥ പറയുന്ന സിനിമകൾ ഉണ്ടാക്കിയത്. വ്ളാഡിമിർ പ്രോപ്സ് വർക്ക് ഫിലിം on the narrative structure of the Russian folk tale has inspired, you know, such a narrative has inspired the development of, it has inspired the development of the narrative as an important area in the film studies. The events or structures selected or managed in a particular pattern in order to create certain meaning forms the plot of the narrative. Which is the plot of the narrative? The events, as I have already, plot means characters and events. The events or the situations. The events or the situations selected by the filmmaker or the scene writer and arranged in a particular pattern in order to create certain meaning. You know, the Events and situations are selected or arranged in a particular way, particular pattern. What is the purpose of arranging it in a particular pattern? In order to create certain meaning, in order to give the spectators certain meaning, forms the plot of the narrative. The visual and auditory elements such as sound, mise-en-scène should also be arranged in order to create effective filmic narration. For creating effective filmic narration, these are also highly essential. What are essential? The visual and auditory elements. Drishya, Shravya, Khadagangal. Drishya, Shravya, Khadagangalam, sound, Shravya Khadagam, mise-en-scène ഉള്ള എല്ലാ 5 ഘടകങ്ങളും എന്താണ്? അത് ദൃശ്യ ഘടകങ്ങളാണ്. അതും പ്രോപ്പറായിട്ട് അറേഞ്ച് ചെയ്യണം in a narrative. The visual and auditory elements such as sound, mise-en-scène should also be arranged in order to create proper. The film theorist David Bordwell, who developed an interesting formal system in film. The style of narrative was brought about by David Bordwell. It was David Bordwell who developed a formal system in film. The well-established plot pattern of narrative could be seen in the classical Hollywood cinema. We studied it. The well-established, the well-knit plot pattern, Enigma-Resolution, order-disorder pattern. The well-established plot pattern of narrative could be seen in the classical Hollywood cinema. We have done a video on classical Hollywood cinema. Please watch it. Narrative cinema makes use of certain strategies. Narrative cinema makes use of, it uses certain strategies. ചില തന്ത്രങ്ങൾ ഉപയോഗിക്കാറുണ്ട് വിജയത്തിന് വേണ്ടി. അല്ലെങ്കിൽ to reproduce the real world. കഥ പറയുമ്പോൾ ആ പഴയ ലോകത്തിൻ്റെ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ആ കഥയുടെ ലോകം റീക്രിയേറ്റ് ചെയ്യാൻ വേണ്ടി ചില തന്ത്രങ്ങൾ ഉപയോഗിക്കാറുണ്ട്. നാരേറ്റീവ് സിനിമ മേക്സ് യൂസ് ഓഫ് certain strategies for reproducing the real world. In the traditional mainstream cinema, in the traditional mainstream box office cinema, it is the male who is the motivator. In the narratives, often it has been, there was exception, often it has been the male who is the motivator or the protagonist. The protagonist will be, or the motivator will be a male person. A male domination could be seen in earlier narratives. The narrative films, narrative movies follow a pattern of order disorder. All order becomes a disorder. And enigma, puzzle, resolution. Puzzle is resolved or it is solved at the end. So that is the pattern of most of the narrative films. The narrative films follow a pattern of order disorder, enigma-resolution. Most narrative films are based on male sexuality. Male will dominate the screen. Male will dominate the story and portray most of the narrative films portray man's attempts to enter successfully in the social conventions of patriarchy. Man enters successfully in the patriarchal world or male dominated world. So that is the pattern of the earlier narrative stories. Most narrative films are based on male sexuality, remember. And most narrative films portray man's attempts, not women's, man's attempts to enter successfully into the social conventions of patriarchy. Patriarchy means male domination. So this is the case of most of the narrative films. Of course there were exceptions. We have seen so many narratives. I am not citing the examples. So many narratives in which women have dominated. Then another another genre of film, that is avant-garde, A-V-A-N-T-G-A-R-D-E. Avant-garde film. Avant-garde film, you know that, experimental film. A film of experimentation, avant-garde film. Avant-garde film. The French term avant-garde means advance garde or avant-garde. On-guard or advance guard. That is the meaning of avant-garde. Advance guard or on-guard are associated with military and political term. So advance guard and on-guard are associated with military or politics. The French term avant-garde means advance guard or on-guard, which was originally military or political term. It was later extended in meaning to refer to that body of artists or writers who experiment with art, revolting against a tradition. Later the meaning was extended to avant-garde term was extended to meaning of this avant-garde was extended to refer to that body, that group of artists, that body of artists, painters or writers who experiment with art or literature, revolting against a tradition. They revolted against a tradition. പാരമ്പര്യത്തിനെതിരെ വിപ്ലവം നയിക്കുന്ന ഒരു കൂട്ടം കലാകാരന്മാരോ സാഹിത്യകാരന്മാരോ ഈ ഒരു ജനുസിൽ ഉൾപ്പെടാൻ തുടങ്ങി. ആ ഒരു ജനുസിലേക്ക് ഇതിൻ്റെ അർത്ഥതലം മാറി. avant-garde എന്ന് പറയുന്നതിൻ്റെ അർത്ഥം പൊളിറ്റിക്സിൽ നിന്നും മിലിറ്ററിയിൽ നിന്നും ഇങ്ങോട്ട് മാറി. It was later extended to refer to that body of artists or writers who experiment with art or literature, revolting against a tradition. The avant-garde film was a movement based on modernism. Avant-garde film was a movement which was based on modernism. Don't forget, it was a modernist movement in films. Avant-garde means the modernist movement in movies or films. The avant-garde film was a movement based on modernism, which could be traced to the broader trends and practices associated with the fine arts in 1920s. This avant-garde experiment in films was associated with the experimentation which happened in fine arts, paintings in 1920s. So avant-garde films have a close connection with the paintings of the 1920s. Don't forget it. The avant-garde film exploited the unique artistic vision of the filmmaker in manipulating the techniques of light, motion, space and time. The avant-garde film exploited the unique, unparalleled artistic vision of the filmmaker. ഫിലിംമേക്കറിൻ്റെ കലാപരമായ ആ ഒരു കാഴ്ചപ്പാട് avant-garde ഫിലിംസ് ചൂഷണം ചെയ്ത്. അങ്ങനെ ഏതിലൊക്കെയുള്ള കാഴ്ചപ്പാടുകൾ? ദ ടെക്നിക്സ് ഓഫ് ലൈറ്റിൻ്റെ യൂസ്, മോഷൻ, മൂവ്മെൻറ്റിൻ്റെ, സ്പേസ് ആൻഡ് ടൈം. സ്പേസിനെയും ടൈമിനെയും ഷോട്ടുകൾ കൊണ്ടും അതുപോലെ ക്യാമറ ഫ്രെയിംസ് കൊണ്ടും എഡിറ്റിങ്ങിലൂടെയും, മൊണ്ടാഷ് പോലുള്ള എഡിറ്റിങ്ങിലൂടെയും അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഷോട്ടുകളുടെ വയലേഷൻ മൂലവും ഈ സ്പേസിനെയും ടൈമിനെയൊക്കെ മാറ്റിമറിച്ചു എക്സ്പെരിമെൻ്റൽ ഫിലിംസ്. The avant-garde film exploited the unique artistic vision of the filmmaker in manipulating the techniques of light, motion, movement, action, space and time. The works of these avant-garde films included in Rhythm 21 by Hans Richter. The filmmaker is Hans Richter in 1921. Rhythms 21. It is an experimental short film. Then Symphony Diagonal, directed by Viking Egling in 1924. It is a 9-minute animation movie. 9-minute animation movie. It is also an experimental film in which musical organization of time could be seen. Musical organization of time. Time is organized on musical basis is seen in this animation film directed by Eng.Litt.Sem in 1924, titled Symphonic Diagonal, in which musical organization of time could be seen. The influence of Cubism. What is Cubism? Cubism is an early 20th century style. We have discussed earlier. Cubism is an early 20th century style and movement in art, especially painting, in which perspective with a single point is abandoned and use was made of simple geometric shapes, interlocking planes and later collage. Cubism എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ എന്താണ്? ക്യൂബിസം എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ ജിയോമെട്രിക്കൽ രൂപങ്ങൾ ഉപയോഗിച്ചുള്ള പെയിൻറ്റിങ്സ് ആയിരുന്നു. അങ്ങനെയുള്ള പെയിൻറ്റിങ്സ് ഒരുതരം കൊളാഷ് സമ്പ്രദായമാണ് ഈ ക്യൂബിസത്തിൽ ആവിഷ്കരിച്ചിരുന്നത്. ആ ക്യൂബിസത്തിൻ്റെ ഇൻഫ്ലുവൻസ് സിനിമയിലുണ്ടായി. അതിൻ്റെ ഏറ്റവും നല്ല ഉദാഹരണം ലേ ബാലെ മെക്കാനിക് directed by Fernand Leger in 1924. The influence of Cubism like Le Ballet Mechanic directed by Fernand Leger in 1924 is an example. Then Anemic Cinema, another experimental film by Marcel Duchamp, released in the year 1927. Then Surrealism, we can see Surrealism in La Coquille, Les Clergyman by Germain Dulac, which came out in the year 1927. La Coquille, Les Clergyman, in which Surrealism is experimented in this film, in the experimental film, and Andalusian Dog, which was out in the year 1929. You know, artistic movements, or the movements which could be seen in paintings, artistic movements like Surrealism, Futurism and Constructivism had a major influence on the avant-garde movement in cinema. One of the major influence of avant-garde cinema in North America during and after the Second World War. One of the major influences of the avant-garde cinema in North America during and after the Second World War was The Blood of a Poet. Remember this name. The Blood of a Poet by Jean Cocteau. It was directed by Jean Cocteau, a French filmmaker. Then Europe and North America witnessed an explosion of the experimental cinema during the 1960s and 1970s. നമ്മുടെ കേരളത്തിലൊക്കെ 1970-കളുടെ അവസാനവും 80-കളുടെ ആദ്യമൊക്കെയാണ് ഈ ഒരു പരീക്ഷണ സിനിമകൾ. ജി അരവിന്ദൻ, ജോൺ എബ്രഹാം തുടങ്ങിയ ഫിലിം മേക്കേഴ്സിൻ്റെ നേതൃത്വത്തിൽ ഈ അവാങ്കാർഡ് ഫിലിംസ് ഉണ്ടായത് 70-കളുടെ അവസാനത്തിലും 80-കളുടെ ആദ്യവുമൊക്കെയാണ്. ഭരതൻ്റെ ചില സിനിമകൾ, ആരവും പോലുള്ള സിനിമകൾ, ജോൺ എബ്രഹാമിൻ്റെ അഗ്രഹാരത്തിലെ കഴുത, അമ്മയെ അറിയാൻ ഒരു ഡോക്യു ഫിക്ഷണൽ സ്റ്റോറി എന്ന് വേണമെങ്കിൽ അമ്മയെ അറിയാമെന്നുള്ള ആ സിനിമയെ നമുക്ക് വിളിക്കാം. ഇതെല്ലാം പരീക്ഷണ സിനിമകളാണ് മലയാളത്തിലെ. These are all experimental films. French film theorists of the 1920s decided to separate themselves from the tradition by making experiments with their central practice in filmmaking. A group of French theorists of the 1920s decided to break away from their traditions by making experimentations by creating experimentations with their central practice in filmmaking. 1920-കളിൽ ഒരു കൂട്ടം ഫ്രഞ്ച് തിയറിസ്റ്റുകൾ ഈ പരമ്പരാഗതമായ സമ്പ്രദായങ്ങളിൽ നിന്നും വിട്ടുമാറുവാൻ തീരുമാനിച്ചു. The issues under consideration varied from, according to them, the issues under consideration varied from the concepts of high and popular art, realism versus naturalism, realism set against naturalism, spectator screen relationship, editing style, subjectivity, psychoanalytical potential of film, author theory, the director is everything, the theory, author theory, etc. The issues under consideration, they considered the issues like the concept of high and popular art, realism versus naturalism, spectator screen relationship, കാണികളും സ്ക്രീനും തമ്മിലുള്ള ബന്ധം. കാണികൾ വെറുതെ സിനിമ കണ്ട് ആസ്വദിച്ചാൽ പോലെ ചിന്തിക്കണം, ദേ ഹാവ് ടു തിങ്ക്. ദെൻ എഡിറ്റിംഗ് സ്റ്റൈൽ, സിനിമയുടെ നൂതന രീതിയിൽ ഉണ്ടാക്കാൻ ആവിഷ്കരിക്കാൻ വേണ്ടി എഡിറ്റിംഗ് സ്റ്റൈൽസിൻ്റെ പൊളിച്ചെഴുത്ത്. സബ്ജക്റ്റിവിറ്റി, psychoanalytical potential of film, the psychoanalysis which can be used in films. നമ്മുടെ സിഗ്മണ്ട് ഫ്രോയിഡ് ആവിഷ്കരിച്ച സൈക്കോ അനാലിസിസിൻ്റെ സിനിമയിൽ കൊണ്ടുവരല്. സൈക്കോ അനാലിസിസ് ഒരുപാട് സിനിമകൾ അങ്ങനെ വന്ന് വിജയിച്ചു. മലയാളത്തിൽ തന്നെ പണ്ട് കാലത്ത് ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു പുനർജന്മം പോലുള്ള സിനിമകൾ. ദെൻ ഓറ്റർ തിയറി, ദീസ് വെയർ ദി ഇഷ്യൂസ് അണ്ടർ കൺസിഡറേഷൻ ഫോർ ദി ഫ്രഞ്ച് ഫിലിം തിയറീസ്. Then the mixing of genres, fusion of popular cinema with experimental cinema, പോപ്പുലർ സിനിമ എക്സ്പീരിയൻസ് സിനിമയോടെ ഫ്യൂസ് ചെയ്യുക, മിക്സ് ചെയ്യുക എന്ന് പറയുന്ന സമ്പ്രദായം. ആൻഡ് ബ്രിങ്ങിങ് ടുഗദർ ദി സോഷ്യോ റിയലിസം ആൻഡ് ദി സബ്ജക്റ്റീവ് വേർ ടിപ്പിക്കൽ ഫീച്ചേഴ്സ് ഓഫ് avant-garde, ആൻഡ് ഓൾസോ ബ്രിങ്ങിങ് ടുഗദർ ദി സോഷ്യോ റിയലിസം ഇൻ സൊസൈറ്റി, സോഷ്യോ റിയലിസം ആൻഡ് ദി സബ്ജക്റ്റീവ്, ആത്മനിഷ്ഠപരമായ ഒരു വീക്ഷണം. Subjective typical features of avant-garde. Which were the typical features of avant-garde? You see the typical features: mixing of genres, fusion of popular cinema with the experimental cinema, and the bringing together of socio-realism and the subjective typical features of avant-garde. Doing away with the conventional traditional shots. The experimental filmmakers wanted to do away with, avoid, neglect the conventional traditional പരമ്പരാഗതമായ ഷോർട്സിനെ അങ്ങ് ഉപേക്ഷിക്കാൻ തീരുമാനിച്ചു. ആൻഡ് അഡോപ്റ്റിംഗ് ദി ഡിസ്കണ്ടിന്യൂറ്റി ഫാസ്റ്റ് എഡിറ്റിംഗ്, ആൻഡ് ഓൾസോ ദേ ട്രൈഡ് ടു യൂസ് ദി ഡിസ്കണ്ടിന്യൂറ്റി എഡിറ്റിംഗ്, എ കൈൻഡ് ഓഫ് montage. Discontinuity fast editing were employed to disrupt the diegetic time and space. The diegetic means the frame given time and space were disrupted or broken by the adoption of discontinuity fast editing and avoiding of conventional traditional shots. Doing away with the conventional traditional shots and adopting the discontinuity fast editing, and these things were employed to disrupt the diegetic time and space. Apart from surrealism, psychoanalysis, surrealism കൂടാതെ തന്നെ സൈക്കോ അനാലിസിസ്, നേരത്തെ പറഞ്ഞ സൈക്കോ അനാലിസിസ് എന്ന് പറയുന്ന ആ ഒരു സ്റ്റോറി, ആ ഒരു പ്ലോട്ട് കൊണ്ടുവരിക. Apart from surrealism, psychoanalysis, the major influences were Soviet cinema. Apart from the surrealism and psychoanalysis, major influences in experimentation of films were Soviet cinema and German expressionism with the unique editing and lighting practices, with the unique type of editing style and lighting practices. The three stages of the first avant-garde can be easily demarcated as the subjective cinema, the pure cinema and the surrealist cinema. These were the three stages of earlier or the first avant-garde films, which are the three first avant-garde types: subjective cinema, the film is narrated in the subjective style, then the pure cinema, and the surrealist cinema. And the three dominant or main chief types of avant-garde are the self-reflexive, reflection of one's self-reflexive avant-garde, the political and narrative avant-garde. The political and narrative avant-garde. Three types of avant-garde films are self-reflexive and political avant-garde, and another one, what is it? Political avant-garde, narrative avant-garde. The self-reflexive avant-garde was predominantly American. It came from American film source. The self-reflective or self-reflexive avant-garde was predominantly American and was influenced by modernist painters. The film was influenced by modernist painters. Political avant-garde was influenced by Bertolt Brecht's theory of distanciation or alienation effect. Political avant-garde was influenced by Bertolt Brecht's theory of distanciation or alienation effect and Sergei Eisenstein's montage theory. The narrative avant-garde brought into practice the theory of counter cinema, which was predominantly European. The narrative avant-garde brought into practice the theory of counter cinema, which was European. It explored new vistas in cinematic language, including the spectator as the producer of the text. The avant-garde films explored new vistas or new pathways. They explored new pathways in cinematic language. They invented new cinematic language, including the spectator as the producer of the text. അതായത് കാണികളാണ് ആ കഥ ഉണ്ടാക്കേണ്ടത്, കാണികളാണ് ടെക്സ്റ്റ് ഉണ്ടാക്കേണ്ടത്, കാണികളാണ് തീരുമാനിക്കേണ്ടത്, കാണികളാണ് നിർണ്ണയിക്കേണ്ടത് എന്നുള്ള ആ ഒരു തത്വമായിരുന്നു avant-garde ഫിലിംസിൽ പ്രധാനമായിട്ടുണ്ടായിരുന്നത്. avant-garde ഫിലിംസിലെ പ്രധാനി ഫിലിം മേക്കറല്ല, ദി സ്പെക്ടേറ്റേഴ്സ് ആയിരുന്നു. So these are the three genres of films we have studied, which are the documentary, narrative and avant-garde. Avant-garde, narrative films and documentary films. Study these things.